Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It is Friday, February 2nd, 2024. It's my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Robert J. Lang. Robert, wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me in your studio.
Thanks for coming by. I'm
Robert,
looking forward to this.
To start, would you please tell me your current titles and institutional affiliations?
I am an independent contractor. Artist consultant is what I list as my occupation. And institutional affiliations vary depending on what projects I'm with. Currently, I have a visiting research associate appointment at Caltech, which is kind of a continuation of a project I did with the mechanical engineering department at Caltech, working with Kaushik and Sergio Pellegrino.
Kaushik Bhattacharya.
Yeah, Bhattacharya, the current provost.
Yes.
And a project with Brigham Young University, with whom I've had on and off, mostly on projects since about 2012. Again, working with the mechanical engineering department. In both cases, projects were applications of folding to technological ends. And let's see, also working on a project with Florida International University, same sort of thing. That's under an Air Force MURI program. I do that work pretty much remotely, and in fact, because BYU is part of it, some of my work with BYU is for the FIU project.
Now, because of the neighborhood, because of the Caltech connections, are there any partnerships with JPL or that could be had with JPL?
Not currently, but I've had several since I became full-time origami. Probably back in the early 2000s, came in to do just a one-day consulting review of a shroud, a foldable shroud. They asked me, do you see anything here that that stands out or that you might want to add to? And they had picked a good pattern, so in the end it was just sort of saying, yep, that works. Another project, which is a current project at JPL, is a program called Starshade. That's a pretty neat concept for a space-based telescope designed to look for planets around other stars. And the way that works is you launch your telescope up into space and you point it at the star. But a star is roughly 10 million times brighter than the planets around it, and so you need to block out the light from the star to have any hope of seeing the planet. And to block it out to a factor of something like 10 to the 7th, you not only need to block the direct light, but you need to be able to block any light that's diffracted around the edges of what you block it out with. And the optical designers have computed there is a shape that will perform this blocking. It's called an occulter, and it looks like a sunflower and flies about 30. It's about 30 meters across and flies a couple kilometers from the spacecraft. So, I want to look at that. I've got my spacecraft here, and I put my occulter into view, and it's blocking the star, and then I can see the planet just off to the side in principle. So that's an active project under development. But both the telescope and this large occulter need to be packaged into a small size to fit into a rocket, and the occulter is so large that and it's a big flat surface, so you need to figure out a way to fold this big flat surface down to a much smaller size. And so I got involved in that project, used my knowledge of folding patterns from origami combined with the engineering knowledge of how to model it mathematically and write computer code to generate the fold pattern. And so did that work for the JPL group. And now this was at least somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago. It was a while back. But they built on that, and they built some prototypes, done some demos, About a year ago, the February 2023 National Geographic featured Starshade on the cover and talked about it in the article. So that was kind of the biggest JPL related project. So I'm not currently working with them, but I keep my eye on it because I really want to see it, pass all its hurdles and go into space.
Robert, I can't help but ask, the magnificent unfurling of the James Webb Telescope, were you involved in that? Do you see an origami aspect to what they accomplished?
There definitely is an origami aspect. I wasn't involved, and although that telescope has some very impressive mechanisms in it, so designed by fantastic mechanical engineers, there weren't many kind of folding origami-like motions. There were, strut and hinge booms that expanded. The things that there was the solar baffle underneath it that was a thin sheet, but they didn't really need to do a specific folding design because it was so thin. You could just sort of pleat it and crumple it to compress it down and then stretch it out like stretching a sheet. The actual folding was in the telescope itself, but only two folds. The sides fold in to make it sort of long and skinny to fit in a rocket. So again, didn't need origami for that. They did, however, approach me and ask me to create an origami rendition of the telescope because all the folding reminded people of origami, and so they thought, oh, well, this will just be sort of a fun thing. So I figured out how to do a paper origami version of the James Webb, but wasn't involved in the actual one.
Do you see this as the vanguard of space telescopes, having something that needs to be enormous out in space, and the only way to do that is to have it folded during launch and then unfurled once it gets into outer space?
Well, the requirement of having it smaller and then get larger is definitely the vanguard of future space telescopes. Now, it happens not just with the telescope optics, but things like antennas, solar arrays. All these things need to be big and flat when they get up into space. But there's multiple ways of deployment. So origami is one candidate, but there are also, for example, for solar arrays, they're now flexible enough that you can roll them up. And while we think of origami, and historically origami has been folding with few or no cuts, if you allow cutting, there are other deployment mechanisms that one can create where, for example, you dice up the flat surface into strips, but then join those strips, and then they can be maybe rolled or they might be folded, but there's also other mechanisms involved to keep the strips in alignment. So it would definitely be overstating to say that origami is the way of the future, but it is in the toolkit of designers of deployables for the future.
Let's move to your areas of expertise, how you see the world and your training. So first, obviously, there is a professional training to get in physics. Mm-hmm. Is there a professional training in origami, certification, a master apprenticeship? What does it take to become a master in origami?
Well, there are in Japan, the Japanese National Society can give a certification for teaching origami, and you have to learn a handful of particular designs that are taught and demonstrate your teaching prowess, and then you get a certificate for it. But interestingly, that is, and pretty much all of the things that approximate a professional certification are about reproducing existing designs in some circumstance. Even the kind of master-apprentice relationship that was traditional in Japan, to become a master, one would be able to reproduce the work of a master, so fold someone else. But the skills that you need in engineering design or the skills to be considered a master in the modern origami world are you need to be able to design new things. And there's no formal certification, stamp of approval.
Your TED talk just came up. I just I had it pulled up. It just popped up.
Oh, okay, you'll see some references to the star shade in there. I think that's in TED. Anyhow, let's see. Yeah, so to design, there's no certification, stamp of approval, anything, and so anyone could call themselves an origami master, and there's no formal way to dispute it. Most people who I consider origami masters are sort of modest enough that they wouldn't call themselves an origami master. I certainly don't refer to myself that way, even though others do, and I don't try to correct them too harshly. So it's much less formal. It's like if you ask someone to name a handful of, name 10 or 20 origami masters, most of us would name most of the same people.
Yeah.
But none of us have a certificate on their wall or a badge around their neck.
But the combination sounds like technical mastery with imagination to create your own designs.
Yeah, and that has even changed somewhat over the years because the techniques for the technical mastery have been defined, documented, and taught. And so now, pure technical mastery isn't enough. You need some artistic excellence as well. Meaning, for example, back in, let's say, 30 years ago, just to create something that had lots of arms and legs and antenna was considered the pinnacle of challenge, and very few people could do it. It was almost mysterious. And so just if you could create a spider that had all 8 legs, design a spider that had all 8 legs, that in itself people would say, yeah, that person must be a master and so forth. But starting kind of in the 90s and early 2000s, several of us laid out very step-by-step processes by which you could design a spider or anything you want. You say, I want a figure with this many limbs, and I want the limbs to be this long, and I want them to be branched, so I want fingers on the hands, and you could really specify the structure to a high degree of a very complex shape, and then kind of systematically construct the pattern of folds that you need to fold that thing. And that was great. It brought origami to the masses, but design to the masses. Lots of people could design, but a lot of the things people design end up looking could look very sort of blocky or not particularly impressive and not very beautiful or distinctive. And so what it takes now is to be considered a master is not just to be able to design something with lots and lots of features, but design it and fold it in a way that it's very striking. Or to come up with a new way of designing that captures the artistic concept that someone's after in a non-obvious way. People are doing more abstract or figures, incorporating soft folds rather than very sharp geometric folds and things like that. And so the masters of the current era have both, generally, to be considered a master, they have technical mastery of some broad aspect of folding, but also an artistic sense that is much harder to quantify, but you can look at it and say, this is a beautiful piece. This one, not so much. And it might be the same subject with the same features.
Now, the way you see the world, the way you go about your work, are you a scientist who does origami? Are you an origamist who does science? Or are those distinctions not meaningful to you?
They're well, before your third clause, my answer would have been yes. In that everything I do that's artistic, I'm drawing upon the mathematical understanding of structure and shape and how things come together. And I talk about math in its true broadest sense of the study of patterns and relationships, not when you say math to people and they think arithmetic or they think algebra, and those are aspects of math, but math is really about much broader concepts and things that don't resemble arithmetic and algebra. And what math I know informs my origami and allows me, in many cases, to design the figures I'm after in an artistic way. So there, you'd say, yeah, I'm an artist, but I'm using origami in my work. But when I'm doing an engineering project about folding, how do I take a medical device and make it smaller, so that it can fit in a catheter or something like that? I'm definitely solving doing engineering, sometimes mathematical modeling and calculations and thinking about the structural properties and the material properties and so forth. But there's also a search I'm also trying to find elegant solutions rather than brute force. And elegance is an aesthetic thing. So that's really art kind of coming into the engineering aspect. And I suspect most engineers would say we consciously strive for elegance in our solutions. That aesthetics does play a role. And the best engineering is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Maybe if I could reframe the question negatively, is there any technical work that you do that doesn't involve origami? Or is there any artistic work that you do that doesn't involve science and math and engineering?
On the first part, there is definitely the case, because my hobby that's evolved over the past several years is maintaining a website and supporting helping develop a content management system that it's based on. There's really no origami in that. It's purely technical, it's computer programming, but it's still fun. And I'm still motivated by aesthetics when doing it. Then conversely, on the art side, I can't think of any arts that I do that don't have some connection to origami. I mean, there's ones I might have in another life, or if there were more hours in a day, I might have pursue other arts, other sculptural arts that don't relate to folding. But I just don't have time to really go down that path, so I don't.
In the way that your career blends art and origami and technical expertise, does this build on an intellectual lineage? In generations past, are there origamists who have taken a scientific approach, or is this really more of a modern innovation that you represent?
It is a modern innovation, but I'm still standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
In fact, the whole modern world of origami, I would say really, even though origami itself as a kind of a recognizable pastime goes back hundreds and hundreds of years in Japan, and folding is in other cultures as well as Japan. Deepest roots are Japanese, and so that's kind of why we use the Japanese term for it. But the modern form of origami really got kicked off in the middle of the 20th century, a couple of Japanese masters, in particular Yoshizawa, began developing new figures. And then in the 50s and 60s, artists in some other countries, the US, England, Spain, Argentina, also began creating new figures and also getting in touch with each other and kind of sharing what they did. And that ability to share, I think, sort of revved up the engine, so to speak, so that by the early 1960s, there were maybe 15 or 20 internationally known designers and several books of their works of new designs. But at that time, people designed primarily, really I'd say exclusively, based on kind of their intuitive understanding of how paper behaves. It wasn't really, there wasn't a deterministic way to design something. It was sort of, you want to design new things, you kind of think about how similar things I know how to fold, maybe I could change something and, and try it out and go that route. And then in the 70s and 80s, people started identifying more systematic ways of designing, like ideas of taking sections of crease patterns from existing designs and cutting them up into little tiles and then reassembling pieces of multiple patterns in different sizes and scales to build up larger and larger structures. In the 90s, that was, and let me just pause there to kind of mention, I started folding from books in the 60s, so was sort of watching this and learning from people all along. It was in the 90s that I started trying to develop a more formal mathematical description of the process of design. How would you specify a shape that you wanted? If you want so many legs and their lengths, how does, let's just to use that as an example, you'd specify the number of appendages on the thing you wanted, how long they are, and how they're connected to each other. Like if you're doing a person, you want the arms connected up here, but the legs connected down here, and a body in between. And so you would specify the structure that way, and then what I worked on or figured out was how do you translate that into constraints on the crease pattern, on where the hand goes on the paper, where the head goes, where the legs go, and so forth. And developed a mathematical methodology that related those two so that you could actually write down a set of equations that, inequality equations that describe what was and wasn't possible. And then you could solve those equations for a pattern that satisfied all those equations. And it gave you a folding pattern that would fold into that shape. And that really changed the process of design, because now you could say, yeah, I want exactly this arrangement of arms and legs and wings and antenna and other parts, and either do some math or do some sketching or do a combination of sketching and math, and end up with a plan for a pattern that was guaranteed to work, to fold into that shape. And that kind of sent, and I taught that and wrote about it and so forth, and there were others in working on similar sorts of things. So it wasn't just solo me. In fact, the main kernel idea was a technique called circle packing, because you would represent each flap by a circular region of the paper, and then you pack them like packing a crate of oranges and beach balls and so forth. And that gave you the pattern you wanted. And I discovered that a Japanese artist named, actually I think he's a biochemist named Meguro, had also come up with this concept of circle packing. We discovered this when I was invited to Japan in '92, and during a lull in the activities, one of the people saw me sketching a circle pack design. I was designing a beetle and I was drawing little circles, doing my way of designing, and he said, "I know what you're doing because Meguro does the same sort of thing." And so we got together and compared notes and found we had discovered many of the same concepts, and it allowed us to design those sorts of things. But in origami, people share pretty widely. We didn't try to keep our methods secret. We shared them as widely as we could, and other people then started using those ideas and building upon them, coming up with their own sort of improvements and tweaks. And so I'd say by around 2000, the techniques to design complex folding were getting pretty widespread, and origami took off.
Is this when theory enters your work in the 1990s, having these concepts inform what you were capable of doing, and it matched the original idea?
Yeah, the original idea was that I wanted to develop a mathematical description of the design process, and in a formal mathematical way, or to write down algebraic equations where each term represented something that was going on in the real world in the design process.
Does that make new designs possible by having that level of theoretical precision at the outset?
Yeah, because it takes the design out of one person's mind. You can break it down into parts. So if the whole design is too complex to hold in your own mind at once, you can break it up into pieces and do a little bit of it at a time once you've put it down on paper. And that's kind of an engineering method. If you are trying to think of an example. If you're making a simple tool, you might just grab a piece of pipe and drill a couple holes where you need it. But if you're making a bunch of pieces of pipe that have to fit together to make a structure, and you know that the holes on this piece need to line up with the holes on that piece, then you're better off having a plan of the whole thing, where you can make sure that you've cut all the pieces to the right length and the holes are in the right place and so forth. And so rather than just trying to hold the whole thing in your mind, exceptional people can still do it all in their own mind. And one of my colleagues in origami design, who was named John Montrol, was exactly this sort of person. He never needed to resort to the mathematical methods because he could design. He really could envision the whole thing in his mind. I just knew it had to be there. It's like Mozart, the whole tune was in his head to begin with. But using the formal mathematical methods lets people go beyond, accomplish things beyond their innate ability. So it's like a force multiplier in art and design.
From paper making to computational modeling, what are some of the technological advances over the course of your career that make what you do possible that might simply not have even been available to the giants of previous generations?
Paper making is one, because one of the limitations on folding something complex is the buildup of layers. If you're trying to make something that has 100 layers in it, you fold it over and then fold it in half again and half again. So you want to make a long, skinny feature. But every time you fold it in half, it's getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And most available papers, the thickness will build up. You say, okay, well, I'll go to something thin like tissue paper. But then the stresses of folding can rip it apart if it's too thin. And one of the developments in the world of paper making was to develop or discover papers that are really, really thin, but still very, very strong. And there are artisan paper makers who developed papers specifically for origami that allowed us to fold more complex figures, allowed us to fold our own complex designs that we couldn't have folded with the papers that were available 20 years ago.
When you start a project, does it always begin physically? Are you always working with paper in your hands, or sometimes you're starting on the computer?
Oh, if it depends, but if it's a really complex thing, it always starts with a design. Either it might be a combination of pencil and paper drawing, or work on a computer, design on a computer. And even designing on a computer can be one of two ways. In some designs, I'm just using the computer to record as a drawing tablet, to record my design as I build the design up. Incrementally, I'll create the structure and then start filling in. It's like create the skeleton and then fill in the muscles and bones of the design. And I'm still figuring out in my own head where each line goes, but I'm recording them all on the computer because there's 1,000 lines in the drawing. And that's going to tell me, I'll use that as my plan to fold. But for some designs, I'm actually using the computer, the computational capabilities of the computer to have it solve for where folds need to go. And for the case of almost anything that's pretty complex, I work out a fairly detailed plan before I ever take a sheet of paper. It's only when I'm folding fairly simple things that I can just grab a sheet of paper and start folding.
Are 3D printing or even artificial intelligence, these really futuristic technologies, are they aiding your work? Have you embraced these technologies?
Yes, on 3D printing, not yet on AI. AI is not yet to a stage where it's useful. Let me come back to AI, but for the 3D printing, in fact, literally the last few days, what I've been working on with BYU is computer code to generate a solid model of a deployable shape that will be 3D printed. My collaborator there, which is a student in Larry Howell, Spencer Magleby's group, he's doing the 3D printing, and the idea is to create a shape, to create the folded shape that has 3D printed panels and hinges. So you want the panels where you might have your active areas, antennas or electronics or whatever, or optical elements, lenses, are rigid, but if it's going to deploy with folding, you need hinges that are compliant. And so he's working, and one way of doing that is to separately build the panels and then connect them up with hinges. And the very first deployable thing I worked on at Lawrence Livermore Lab in 1999 was of that nature. The panels were glass. They made flexible metal hinges to connect the glass panels, and that worked. But connecting up all the panels of a complex design is very tedious, and you've got mechanical tolerances on alignment at every single joint. And so you'd like to be able to manufacture it monolithically. 3D printing is ideal for that. So where we are right now, I've solved the origami problem mathematically, meaning I've created a mathematical model of the folding, but what we're working on now is how to specify it computationally for using the limitations of the 3D printing technology to be able to print in one go the device that has both rigid panels, flexible hinges, and achieve the mechanical tolerances that we want to achieve. So 3D printing, it has enabled all sorts of new things in technology, and particularly in space, creating rocket nozzles where you have coolant channels embedded within the metal of the nozzle. There's no way you could do that in classical machining. 3D printing's definitely got a place, and I'm currently involved and expect to be more, continue to be involved in the future in 3D printing of foldable shapes.
But AI is not there yet.
But AI is not there yet, and it's pretty interesting why, I think.
You can't go into ChatGPT with a design and say, show me what this looks like. It's not there yet.
Oh, you can't do that, but you can go into ChatGPT and say, tell me how to fold a dog. Give me instructions for an origami dog. And it will spit out a set of instructions. And the first step will say, take your square, fold it in half along the diagonal, then unfold. And the second step will say something like, bring the corner to the third line. And you go, wait, I just made one fold. There's no third line. Mm-hmm. And then the next step is also completely impossible. What large language models are good at are making things that sound plausibly true, but they have no sense, they have no underlying sense of truth or of reality. And so, as is now well known with models, they're very good at bullshitting. I think there was a famous case not long ago of a lawyer who wrote a legal brief using ChatGPT, and all of the cases cited didn't exist. And the lawyer was severely sanctioned by the judge because of that. So the ChatGPT, the large language models have no underlying sense of reality, and so they can only create things that are plausibly true. You can also go into image generation models like DALL-E or Midjourney and say, show me an origami version of a fish, for example. And you'll get an image that sort of superficially looks like an origami fish. But if you start looking closely, you realize that there are things in that are impossible to accomplish with paper. And so again, it's superficially there, but it's false related when it comes to reality. And to accomplish, with a large language model, to accomplish that connection to reality, you need training data. You would need training data that relates the unfolded paper structurally to that relates elements of the folded paper to where that paper comes out in the finished model. And that data just doesn't exist. No one's even figured out how to code up that sort of deep connection. And if they did, it would be a ton of work. And you need a very large data set. So I think AI is quite far from being able to truly design an origami figure. But I do think it has a role to play. And perhaps the most immediate role is as a source of inspiration. So if you go into one of the image programs and you say, show me an origami fish, and it'll come up with a bunch of things that are, what's actually shown to you are impossible, and may not, but it might, what it shows you might be a way of presenting that you could you could use some aspect of that and actually accomplish it in origami. So it could serve as sort of as an inspiration or a source of ideas. A way of presenting in origami the thing that you don't yet that you hadn't thought of. That hadn't occurred to you.
Is it important for you ever to decouple the computer from the paper? In other words, do you ever play around with designs that are too complex that you could never reproduce physically? And conversely, is it important for you to just sit down like a 7-year-old would and just fold paper without any concern for putting this on the computer?
Yes to both. I only would use a computer if I needed it.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, on a recent trip I was on a boat, no computer, no connection to internet, but I was inspired to fold a couple of the animals that we saw, and so I just took paper and used my own intuition and understanding of how things move to create the figures that I wanted. And now they weren't super complex, but they were a little complex. But I could design it the way people had designed for the past 400 years, just because I have had a lot of experience in folding. I know different ways of achieving certain visual goals. So, yes to the folding without a computer. I'd only use a computer if I'm forced to. Or I'm bumping up against my own limitations. Now, on the other half of your question, and would you repeat the other half of your question?
Just playing around with designs on the computer
yes,
that are either
getting
so
something
complex.
too hard.
Yeah.
Very definitely. I have worked out designs, worked out a complete design. I knew it was possible to fold. Because I followed the rules, so to speak. I knew it was foldable. But when I actually went to start folding, because there were just intricate structures where all the creases needed to come together at once, and many of them were hidden, were half hidden inside, so I couldn't get my fingers to them to manipulate, and I realized this is something that I cannot fold. I cannot fold my own design because I don't have the dexterity. I'd need many additional fingers and many tiny fingers all working together at once to manipulate the paper in these complex ways. So yes, I designed something that's it's like the old can God make a boulder that's too heavy for him to lift, right? I could definitely make origami designs that were too hard for me to fold. And in that case, then, because I knew it was too hard, I backed off on the complexity and made a version that had a somewhat simpler structure for the part I was trying to achieve, and then said, well, I'll just rely on my ability to do artistic shaping to still convey what I was after.
Some overall questions about your collaboration. So first, have you achieved market saturation in terms of all of the scientists and engineers who could benefit from an origami collaboration? Are they aware that this is available to them? Do they know that there are services like yours, there's expertise that would be relevant, or no?
I'd say no, because I regularly get new inquiries from people who say, "Hey, I just heard about you," or I saw this talk on YouTube, or I did a literature search and found your paper, and that they only recently discovered that I was available, or that I did this sort of thing. So I would guess that the vast majority of people out there don't know what's available.
Are there requests you get where you're surprised yourself that once you consider it, there actually is an origami application to the problem at hand?
Not really, because usually when someone approaches me with the problem, they've already seen that origami might be applicable.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see it, I also think it might be applicable. What happens more often is sort of the reverse, that someone comes and says, "Oh, I see you're an expert in origami, and I have this insoluble problem, and origami is a magic bullet that maybe it will fix it," and I have to say, "No, not really." Or say, "Yes, there is an origami solution, but there's almost certainly a better solution in a different field." Probably the most common application there is there's a field called paper engineering, which is cutting and gluing pieces together. It also involves folding. Pop-up books are the classic example of paper engineering that people are aware of. Those castles that pop up, they have folds in them, but there's lots of little pieces and they're cut and glued together to make those beautiful shapes. And so someone will come to me and say, "Can you do an origami solution for this sort of deployment thing?" And I have to say, I could, but there would be a lot of really complex folding to achieve it in origami. But some cutting and gluing would probably make it a lot simpler and easier. But I'm going to suggest you go to a paper engineer, because that's not my expertise, and there are better people out there for that type of development. So I regretfully send them off. And then I try to give them some references for paper engineers I know that they might contact.
And then to flip that around, what are the kinds of challenges that you encounter that would compel you to reach out to a mathematician or a scientist or an engineer?
Well, particularly in the area of mathematics, there are, when the origami field calls for an element of math that I don't know much about. This came up with when I was working with Washington State University on a project that we had to do, because the material that we're working with didn't allow for sharp folding. It required curved folding, gently curved surfaces. And to describe curved surfaces, you need a field called differential geometry, which I mostly never learned. And so to work on that project, in that case I didn't actually have to call up a mathematician, but I had to go find a bunch of differential geometry books and and learn the relevant bits of math to be able to design and describe the surfaces that we were trying to create for that project.
You mentioned earlier the culture of sharing in origami, the openness. Yeah. When is intellectual property, protecting your intellectual product, when is that relevant in your work? When do you need to file for a patent or to protect a copyright? What does that look like in your world?
Okay, because I've been involved in both, patents and copyright. And in my prior life, doing laser physics, I was deeply involved in patenting. When I ended up, I was chief scientist and then VP of R&D for the company I was with. And so our patent lawyer worked for me, and I was involved in a lot of the patenting that we did, and also was inventor on a bunch of the laser patents, but got involved in what makes something patentable and how do you, if someone else has a patent, how do you get around it, legally or without infringing. And as far as patents go, origami is not that much different from any other field. There are patents on folded structures, and that those sorts of folded patents came from people not at all involved in the world of origami. It was just people developing folded solutions to technological problems, corrugated patterns to make structural panels, for example, or deployable mechanisms that just things that deploy that happened to use folding, and they found these folding patterns and wrote patents on them and so forth. So the world of patenting and origami is very much is very firmly part of the broader sphere of engineering and patents. And the considerations that you have are always, are you going to make more money from your invention than it costs you to to pursue patenting, and which is going to be anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000 depending on how internationally you go. And if someone else is infringing your patent, can you detect that they're infringing? And will you make enough money if you go after them to justify the legal costs? Those are kind of universal considerations. And since a lot of origami is a very special purpose, there's not too many patents out there on origami patterns, but there's a few. Then in terms of copyright, copyright comes in more on the artistic side of origami rather than the engineering side. Patents are for tend to be more for engineering applications, and copyright protects artistic expression. It doesn't protect functionality. So, if I come up with a fold pattern, that makes sort of a beautiful cylinder, and someone says, I can use that to make a cup. If I didn't patent it for use as a cup, they can go off and use it for its functionality. But copyright protects expressions. So for copyright, you need to reduce your idea to tangible form. You have to actually physically make the object or create it as pixels of images. You can copyright digital images and so forth. And in copyright law, there's a whole different body of law, including the concept of fair use. So even if you create something, someone can. There are uses that are allowed. In teaching, you can quote from a copyrighted book. You can do small quotations. That's called fair use. So, in the origami, and fair use hinges on various criteria, including the level of transformation, and how close is it to the original artist's usage, and that's why quoting is allowed, and so forth. So, in principle, when I create an origami shape, so if someone makes a duplicate of that shape, they would be infringing my copyright. I could, in principle, go after them, and there would be a lot of back and forth. If they said, well, it's not exactly the same. They'd say, I've changed a few things. And say, well, it's not enough, and the lawyers would write letters to each other, and then come to some sort of a settlement, which might be one of the lawyers saying, go away, or okay, so sue me, and so forth. I've been in a few copyright disputes with people using my work. In some cases, they ended up licensing it. One ended up actually getting legal, but we eventually settled. It's kind of left. I'm not real crazy about the topic just because of that.
A more nebulous but related issue to intellectual property, as you mentioned, because origami is so firmly rooted in Japanese culture and Japanese history. How do you deal with what we might call cultural appropriation or paying homage to a Japanese art form? How do you work through those things?
It's funny that I've never encountered an accusation of cultural appropriation. there's a couple factors that might have entered into that. One is that historically in Japan, origami was not particularly respected. The masters of the 20th century, Yoshizawa, struggled to make a living his whole life. It wasn't until he was 70 or 80 that he got recognition from the government. He was never made a living national treasure, unlike even though he was clearly the most famous origami artist in the world and most highly respected. But in Japan, origami was traditionally viewed as a craft for children and old ladies. And so, you know, people didn't, when others started doing origami, there wasn't any sense of taking something away from Japan. And then Westerners got involved in origami, you know, quite a few by the 50s and 60s, and there was bidirectional interchange. That people in Japan, you know, continued to develop the new designs of their own, but they also learned from Western folders, and Western folders learned from the newer Japanese. And when I went there in '92, I was invited to lecture to the Japanese National Society, the Nippon Origami Association. So it was, you know, I was welcomed as a Westerner doing origami. And in fact, then some months after that, I was invited to go on a game show because I think of the novelty of being a gaijin doing origami.
And to further complicate matters, you mentioned origami or paper folding is not exclusive to Japan. What other cultures do we see a history of paper folding?
So in Spain, there's folding that goes back at least 100 years, probably more. Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno created folded shapes, and it's not clear where how the practice of folding came to Spain. They don't call it origami; they call it papyroflexia, which still means folded paper. In Central Europe, Germany and Italy and the like, there's a history of folding that, again, there's paper folding that's a couple hundred years old in Germany, but there's a 400-year-old art of decorative napkin folding, which uses techniques from origami. I mean, it's folding. They use starch napkins, which behave kind of like thick paper, and they learned, or they practiced actually with paper. So there's a book from about 1500 by an author named Matteo Gieger called Le Tre Tritati, which is a book of folding instructions for these different napkin folds. So, but people actually practiced by folding paper, and you have to think that as soon as someone has a sheet of paper and they're just playing with it, they notice, hey, this folds, and you can change its shape and just play around with it. In China, China invented paper. The practice of paper making came from China to Japan, and there is a tradition of paper folding in China, but its documentation only goes back maybe 100 years. But again, it could be much older. It's just playing around with paper is not something people often wrote books about. But in Japan, it was. There were books of paper folding that go back to the 1700s. And then, in other cultures, Mesoamerica the Aztecs and the Olmecs, they made a very paper-like material from pounded fig bark. It's called amate. And you actually you can still find there are villages who make it for the tourist trade even today, so using the old recipes. But that goes back to like 700, 800 AD. And they made pleated fans, decorations. They made fan-folded books. Most of those artifacts, because paper in a tropical country doesn't last very long, so there aren't many artifacts that are that old. But they did ceramics and stone sculptures of people wearing the pleated decorations, and then the later codices that still exist from like 1500s on show more clearly that those decorations were made from this amate type paper. So modern origami, all these different threads have come into the modern world of origami. Some more recently, that's like, I don't think 30 years ago probably any origami people knew about the Mesoamerican developments, but that's part of the mix. The interchange between Japan and the West has certainly gone on for 100 years. There are early 20th century books that include folding instructions. It's like books of paper toys, and they'll include folding instructions for things that were Japanese, as well as things that might not have been Japanese.
Let's go back and establish some personal history now. Tell me about your childhood, where you grew up.
Okay, well, I was born in Dayton, Ohio. Moved when I was 3 to New Orleans.
Are your parents from Ohio?
Yeah, both of my parents were born and raised in and around Dayton, Ohio. And my dad worked for an air conditioning company. My mom, well, initially so did my mom. That's where they met. And have an older brother, 2 years older, and a younger sister, 3 years younger. When I was 3, we moved to New Orleans because my dad's company transferred him. And then 2 years later, when I was 5, they transferred him to Atlanta, Georgia. And I kind of view Atlanta as where I grew up. We were there, so that would have been, when I was 5, it would have been about 1966. We were there till 1970. Then we moved. Then they transferred him back to Dayton again. And after 2 years, I guess he said, we really liked Atlanta and I'm tired of all the transfers. So he quit to start his own company as a manufacturer's rep, and we moved back to Atlanta. And then the rest of my high school years were in Atlanta.
What neighborhoods in Atlanta did you grow up in?
And so 2 neighborhoods, it was all in the Northeast, in unincorporated DeKalb County, kind of between Tucker and Chamblee. I went to during that time I went to 3rd grade to Henderson Mill Elementary School. Skipped 3rd grade. 4th grade in that elementary school. 5th grade to an elementary school in Ohio. 6th grade to a middle school in Ohio. 7th grade back to high school in Atlanta. So different school each year for 4 years. Henderson High School was the high school then. 7th grade was elementary school, and then 8th grade was high school. So
now in Atlanta, how well integrated or not were the schools?
Not, when I started, not at all, and integration was just starting during the years I was in high school. So this is DeKalb County. I went to an all-white high school, and then there were just a handful of black students coming into the school during the final years that I was there. Since then, demographically, that whole area has changed enormously. So it's not only are the schools much more integrated in terms of black and white, but there's also many, many immigrants who have settled in those areas, and also are in the schools. So there's culturally, the schools now are much more diverse than they were then. It's pretty uniform when I was there.
Growing up, were you particularly inclined towards science and or art?
Well, I always liked to make things, even from a very young age. So I started origami at age 6, folding, found some, so I was always looking for things to do. I was a pretty early reader, so looking for books of crafts and things. The problem with most crafts is you need materials for them, and didn't really have access to that. So when origami came along, when I found these folding instructions and all you needed was paper, that was great, because I could make those shapes over and over because I'd never run out of paper. And it wasn't until much later in life that I realized another appealing thing about origami was that the penalty for messing up was low. Because I always wanted to try something different from what a little bit of contrary strict. I always wanted to try something different from what the instructions were. And in most crafts, you make a mistake and you've ruined the thing you're working on and you have to start over from scratch. Whereas with origami, I mean, yes, that could happen. You ruin, but you just grab another sheet of paper and try it again. It's not like building plastic models, which I did as a kid. If you mess up, a big glob of glue that ruins the surface, the model is ruined. You really don't have no choice but to spend another $5 and get a new one. Save up your allowance for weeks and weeks and weeks to do that. Whereas with origami, grab a new sheet of paper, try it. And so I loved origami because the cost was low, the barrier was low, and if I messed up, I could just try it again. And that appealed to my sense of experimenting and trying new things.
When did you recognize origami was more than just a childlike wonder of folding paper, that there was an art, a history, a culture to it? Was that early on?
No, that probably the understanding of the depth of the culture and so forth didn't really happen until I was in my 20s.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was a passionate hobby. My parents saw that I did this folding things, and they sort of fed the obsession with the occasional birthday gift of an origami book if they saw one, but definitely frequent trips to libraries. And I'd want to go to new library. Once I learned every origami book in our local library, well, could we go to the library on the other side of the county because they might have different origami books, and yeah, we'll do that too.
This is before the internet, of course.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I never, and books were my only connection to this world. I never met another origami folder until I was in my 20s. But so I pursued this, and I tried to fold everything I could find in every book, and so that was a big passion. I also had other interests. I love the outdoors. We was fortunate that every place we lived had woods behind our house, so I could go out in the woods and just explore and look at the plants, look for interesting looking plants and things. And then in high school, a friend gave us, I think it was a bunch of Scientific American magazines, and they had the column by Martin Gardner in the back of them, Recreational Games, essentially recreational mathematics. And I loved those columns. This was fun, not like the math in school, which is tedious and boring. But that got me interested in math. And so the other thing I would look for on these library trips would be books of Martin Gardner's collected columns, Recreational Mathematical Games. And that gave me a very big interest in mathematics. And so those were sort of my passions of origami, the outdoors, math, growing up through high school.
And you intuited the mathematical and engineering basis of origami pretty early on.
No.
You didn't?
They were totally separate.
Uh-huh.
Never dreamed that they'd be related. So in high school, we had the high school had a math team, that would go compete, and they'd throw problems up on the screen and everyone tries to solve them. Actually, there were always two parts. There was a written test and then what was called ciphering, which was a speed challenge. Throw the problem up on the screen, first person to hold up the right answer wins that problem. And so because I was pretty good at math in my classes, I tried out for one of those teams and was very good at it. So then that got me even more interested in exploring math, and convinced me that I should follow some sort of highly technical career. I really thought I'd be a mathematician.
Mm-hmm.
One of our one of our backpacking buddies, who was a working engineer at a company, he was much older than me. But when we was talking about when I was in late high school, and talking about college, and he said, where have you applied, or where are you going to apply? And I said, well, of course, Georgia Tech, UGA, because University of Georgia, that's where my older brother went, and those were like the two schools that anyone in Atlanta would apply to. And he said, well, if you're doing something technical, you should apply to my school, Caltech. And, okay. I mean, it's a really good school, so that'll be my reach school. You've got your reach school and your backup, and that was back in the days when people only applied to 3 or 4 schools at most. Long story short, I was accepted Caltech, and so I went there. And
Did you graduate toward the top of your class in high school?
Yeah, pretty high up. I wasn't valedictorian, but I think I did have the highest SAT score in my school, or maybe second highest. Yeah, I think it was second highest, because they sent 2 of us. They took the 2 top scores from each school and sent us on a bus tour of the state to see, the Chamber of Commerce, go to paper mills in South Georgia, and all sorts of things like that.
What year did you arrive at Caltech?
So I arrived at Caltech in 1978.
And is this your first time in California? Had you any idea what to expect?
Never been to California. And it was really funny. We're flying in, and as we're flying in, I looked out the window at these mountains, the usual approach to LAX, and there was this very thin brownish layer over the mountains. And I thought, oh, so that's the fabled LA smog.
Yeah.
No, but this was Santa Ana. The Santa Ana winds were blowing. That thin brownish layer was like the merest residue, the tiniest bit that was left behind. Because in those days, the 70s, when the smog rolled in, you didn't see the mountains,
right,
even from Caltech.
Right.
But of course, I didn't know that. I had been fortunate in one regard, that during summer programs, after my 10th grade year, I did a county summer program in math. And after the 11th grade year, I did a state summer program in math. And then after 12th, I did a program at the University of Chicago in math. And that was eye-opening, that there are tons of people here who are so much smarter than me.
Yeah.
And over the course of that summer, I learned to deal with that and just buckle down and work my butt off and recognize that I am no longer the sharpest math stud around.
Not having a strong arts program, did you content yourself that you would continue origami as a hobby, or did you?
Origami was always totally a hobby.
But you kept it up.
Oh, but I kept it up. So I get to Caltech, and of course, Caltech is full of, everyone was the math stud of their high school coming in. But I was ready for that, and knew that I'm not going to be the math stud of Caltech, and I'm going to just have to work my butt off just to stay even with those people, which I did, and I managed to stay even with those people. But I also, my freshman year, I took Math 1, the Caltech math course, and this wasn't fun at all. This wasn't the fun math. It was this very formal, structured around proving epsilon delta proofs and n-balls, and this was not fun at all. I came in here thinking I'd be a mathematician, but not doing this. But another thing that Caltech does that I really think was a godsend was, first, you don't declare a major at all when for your freshman year. Second, you are forced to take a variety of courses. In addition to the core courses, you're forced to take a variety of courses in other areas. And I took my freshman year a computer science course, the Introduction to Digital Logic. And I absolutely loved it. It was like, I understand how computers work now. I could see how you build up from transistors to logic gates to flip-flops to counters to finite state machines to how microprocessors work. It's like it all became clear. And I thought,
do you remember who taught that course?
Oh, gosh. I don't.
It wasn't Carver Mead?
No, Carver taught a higher level course. I cannot remember. But that inspired me, and so I said, okay, when I declare, next year I'm going to have to declare a major. I'm going to do electrical engineering because that's what this was about. I want to build these things, and so I became a double E. And then,
Robert, what house did you live in?
Ricketts.
Ricketts.
That was a scurv.
And what were the what was Ricketts known for in your day? What was the character of Ricketts?
Drugs.
Yeah.
Which I did not partake in.
Was it the artsiest house, would you say?
No, it was not as druggy as Dabney, which like Dabney had the reputation of drugs and sort of slacker. Ricketts was drugs, but still, I guess, a little more mixture of other house activities. Definitely not athletics like Page and Fleming were. But
you were not into the drug scene?
Not at all. But I'd go down to walk down to the courtyard in the morning and could smell the pots. I know what, I learned what pot smells like. That's about the limit of it. But I participated in the social life of Ricketts House.
Yeah.
And, so getting back to the sort of chronology of academics. So sophomore year, I'm studying double E and I'm taking circuits classes and labs and loving building circuits. And in fact, and I worked my first summer. Well, I worked in the part-time in the double E stockroom, and during downtime, I would just read data sheets about all the different things they sold in the stockroom and think about what could I build with these. in some cases would go build little widgets that, if the parts weren't too expensive, just because building was fun. I also took a course in the laser lab, which was taught by Bill Bridges, and this was even more fun than circuits, because you could see what was going on because we were working with visible lights. And Bill would wander. We were all in all these labs, and he would wander in and just tell us anecdotes about his research days at Hughes, because he invented the argon ion laser, which is a big family of lasers. It was the only visible laser that was really could get to high powers for years and years. And you'd end up that you would be spending 5 hours in the lab, but that was because 2 of them were listening to these wonderful, wonderful anecdotes from Bill Bridges. And so I just have nothing but the most wonderful memories of that course. But I also said, okay, I am a double E, but I really like lasers and optics, so I'm going to take more optics courses.
And were you known among your friends as the origami guy? Did people know this aspect of your life, or that was more private?
It was more private. I think my close friends probably knew about it, but I didn't decorate my room with origami figures, or make a big deal about it. But in part because I guess I'd somehow absorbed along the way the idea that it was a little bit frivolous.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't make a big deal about it.
Were there any seeds planted, in taking a mechanical engineering class or thinking about math, that, what your career would blossom into? Did you make any of those connections as a Caltech undergrad?
Not yet.
Huh.
Not yet. Because I was an experimentalist as an undergrad. I built electronics things. I didn't particularly care for the formalism of Math 1 or Math 2. Junior year, I took the dreaded junior year course at AMA 95. Its reputation was this was the killer course. And I took AMA 95, and I absolutely loved it. and I think a lot of that was due to the professor I was lucky to get, Don Cohen. Because he had the way of thinking about things that made sense and that was intuitive. He's also very witty and entertaining, but it was more a way of thinking about these problems. So when when most professors, when they would present something, they'd lay out, we're going to assume this, and they would construct these perfect, sparse, logical proof to the end, and that was the lecture. And Cohen would stand up and say, okay, I'm just going to throw some stuff out and make some noise, and do a couple derivations, and then say, and we see a pattern here. And then he'd give, here's the pattern, here's this new concept that we've learned. And it made sense. And that's, I absorbed as a way of approaching a lot of problems going forward, is look at some examples, look for the patterns, hypothesize your pattern, and then you can go back and try to sort of formally describe it. Like when we were doing, he would say, we're violating mathematical rules. We haven't proved that this series converges, but we're going to use it anyhow. And then get to some really good result, and a powerful technique. So I loved AMA 95. So that, and I realized, maybe what I should have gone into was applied math instead of pure math.
Right.
But by then I'm a junior, well into my junior year. It's too late to switch. So I'm if I want to graduate in 4 years, which I do, I'm going to complete the double E degree. But I will take as much lasers and optics as I could squeeze in and as much additional math as I could squeeze in.
What about physics? How much physics did you have?
Just the core physics. And then, junior level quantum mechanics, which is physics, but it's in the double E was very close with applied physics. So I took APH courses. So that was quantum, and but I didn't like the kind of classical physics of cosmology. Never touched it. Never learned it.
Did you ever interact with Feynman?
Not in any technical way, but another thing I was involved in at Caltech was the Caltech musicals.
Oh, wonderful!
Those played a huge role in my Caltech career. And so when we did South Pacific, Feynman was in that, and so we had some modest interactions as part of that. Totally related to the music.
You were in the show, or you were backstage?
No, I was in the show. My freshman year, I became a tour guide. Give campus tours to prospective freshmen. Tour guides started from the PR, public relations office, and so I got to know some of the people who worked in PR, including one of the people who was in the Caltech musical, who was one of the in the crowd scenes, and I was the bass in the barbershop quartet. But at one point, Shirley Marneus, the legendary director of those things, we were doing a crowd scene, and she blocked us to go across stage and talk in the background. I mean, not verbally, but to look like we were having a conversation behind the stars, of the Music Man, and for some reason we rehearsed that scene over and over and over, and so I was often just doing chit chat with a person in PR, and then in this next year we did sophomore year we did Fiddle on the Roof, and again we were both in it, and so we said, "Oh, hi, good to see you again," and chatted and kept up a relation, just acquaintanceship. And same junior year, did Candies. Senior year we did South Pacific. That's when Feynman was in. And I'm going to sort of digress, jump ahead, but I'll come back. So I went up to Stanford for my master's, came back to Caltech for my PhD, did Mikado, and then Kismet, and reconnected with the staff member in PR who was also in Kismet. And at that point, 7 years after we had first met, the sparks flew, and we've now been married 37 years.
Ah, okay. And was she doing children's books, that kind of thing back then? That's a more recent development.
No, that was a very, very recent development, about 20 years ago. And if I don't forget,
we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that. But let's see.
Did you stay on campus during the summers? Did you go back home?
I went back home, and I worked at Scientific Atlanta during summers as a draftsman.
Oh.
Because I'd taken mechanical drafting in high school, which turned out to be a very important class to take. I had, throughout school, I'd always had terrible penmanship, but in mechanical drafting you learn to letter. You have to. So I learned. I learned how to write neatly, but also learned some important things for engineering just from being a draftsman. And then it got me the summer job to work as a draftsman for this for this company that made cable TV equipment. Let's see. Returning from several levels of interrupt and digression.
Were you always set on graduate school coming into junior and senior year? Did you think about industry?
I did, and I wasn't particularly set on graduate school. I interviewed with my senior year. I interviewed with companies, and I had a couple nice offers from companies, but
in what sector? Tech?
Yeah, as an electrical engineer. But it seemed like that was like if you were good at the field, you'd wanted to go as far as possible before going off in industry. And I was good in my field. I was had managed to get really good grades throughout Caltech, and so I just decided my senior year, even though I had industrial offers, I would go on to grad school.
Why Stanford?
It was a very good school. I liked California by then.
And you don't stay at, or at least the idea is you don't stay at Caltech for graduate school.
Right. But I had a girlfriend, not the person I ended up marrying, but I had a girlfriend my senior year, and she was staying in Pasadena. So we tried to maintain the, the long distance relationship, but driving the Central Valley every 3 weeks was not fun.
Yeah.
So pretty early on, I thought, well, I'll try to come back down to Caltech so we can be together. But you don't come back in your old field because you've already taken all the courses, among other things. So that was when I switched to applied physics.
You did double E at Stanford?
Yeah.
How would you compare, obviously it's undergraduate versus graduate, how would you compare the intellectual culture? What was emphasized at Stanford versus Caltech? Was it more applied at Stanford?
No, I wouldn't say it was more applied, but because I was interested in lasers and optics, I was taking a mix of double E courses and physics courses. And I found for my double E courses I could practically sleepwalk through them. Mm-hmm. And my physics courses I had to work really hard. Mm-hmm. And I also, because I didn't have the full Caltech physics undergrad, I had to work a lot harder because I had gaps in my physics knowledge in those physics courses at Stanford. Then came back to Caltech and applied physics.
If not for your girlfriend, do you think you would have stayed on for the PhD at Stanford?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, once I got back down, before too long, we realized, we're really not meant for each other long term. So we broke up. We stayed friends, but it was clear we weren't meant to be a couple. But by then, I was committed and having a really good time. So I came back down, and the two professors who I wanted to do lasers and optics, and the two professors were Ahmed Zawel and Amnon Yariv, who I read your lovely interview with Amnon.
Of course.
And
Zawel was in chemistry?
He was in chemistry.
But he
was doing photochemistry.
Right,
He's
right.
With lasers. And I think it was one of the good reasons. There were many good reasons why I made the right choice by going with Yariv. But one of the good reasons was if I'd worked for Zawel, then I'd probably end up grumbling that I actually had done all the work that he got his Nobel Prize for.
You saw he was on that trajectory already?
No. I had no idea at that time. But actually, what made me even think about that was a year or two in, Amnon invited Nico Blombergen to come give a talk.
Uh-huh.
And what stuck out in Blombergen's talk, he said, it's really the grad students who do all the work for these professors who get their Nobel Prize. And so it was all my grad students did all the work for which I got the Nobel Prize, which was for MRI.
Yeah.
And he said, but I don't feel bad about that because I did all the work for Purcell's Nobel Prize.
That's right. You just pay it forward.
Yeah.
What was Amnon working on at that point?
So he was, that was when he was just getting going with semiconductor lasers.
Okay.
And another thing that, probably a thing that influenced, was one of his grad students was another Caltech, former Caltech undergrad, and, who was a year ahead of me, Carrie Vahala.
Yeah.
And so, there's a little familiarity.
Yep.
Carrie spoke highly of it, of Amnon and the program. And Amnon had a huge group at that time. I
Right.
think like 25 people in this group.
Right. Do you know, was Ortel up and running already, his company?
Yeah, Ortel was already up and running. He and his group, and therefore Ortel, made the fastest semiconductor lasers.
Yeah.
And they'd figured out how to make the fastest lasers.
Right.
And Carrie was doing, really, as a grad student, really cutting edge work on noise in semiconductor lasers, elucidating a really puzzling behavior that everyone had observed out in the field. So it was a great, it looked like a really dynamic group and really fun projects, and so I joined that group.
How did you slot in? What did you work on?
So the way Amnon's group worked, he had this sort of hierarchy of, because he always had postdocs and senior students and then the younger students, and you really didn't, or at least I didn't work. I hardly ever saw Amnon my whole time there, because it was more like the organization. The older students mentored the younger students. So Carrie, my first project, Carrie said, here's sort of a puzzling observation. Why don't you see if you can explain it? There was the line width, the width of the spectral line of diode lasers had this. It was inversely proportional to power. As you turned up the power, the line width got smaller, but it didn't go to zero. It bottomed out, and so the puzzle was what causes the bottoming out. And Carrie said, it could be noise from 2 or 3 other sources. Why don't you look at the effects of those other sources? And so I read a bunch of papers, and I started doing mathematical analysis and found that temperature fluctuations gave a constant level to the noise. And so I wrote a paper with Carrie and Amnon about this, and it was accepted in the journal. So it was my first journal publication, and I thought, wow, that was easy. You just do some mathematical analysis and you get a paper. See, right up to that point, I had been a pure experimentalist. And I was still learning to do experiments. I was learning how to make lasers in Amnon's lab and do all the processing, and I had my own. By that time, I had also had an idea for a type of laser that I'd learned about at Stanford. It was big glass lasers, and said, could we do this kind of laser from semiconductors? So I was doing experimental, but this math was, the bang for the buck was amazing. So a lot of my projects then in that group were involved around theoretical analysis, setting up mathematical models of this or that type of laser, and how you and then solving it to figure out the behavior, analyze the behavior, and couple projects were the sort of thing. We had a person who's specialized in MBE. I think he was a postdoc of Amnon's, named Anders Larsson, who grew really the best laser material anywhere, and because most lasers had these if you made a laser very big, it had very junky looking outputs. And Anders was able to make lasers that were big, and they all behaved exactly the same way with this peculiar flat-topped but little ripply output. And that made no sense, because the prevailing theory said that if you made a perfect laser, its output should be a smooth Gaussian, but not a flat top with a little ripple. And the ripples got smaller as you turned up the power. But all the analysis hadn't included some nonlinear effects. So I set up a model that included nonlinear effects using techniques that I'd learned from Don Cohen in class on singular perturbation theory, and my analysis spit out a flat top with little ripples that got smaller when you turned up the power, and I was like, this is exactly what we did papers together on that, and that with Anders and Amnon and others, and another student, Dave Mayhews, so that's what really got me revved up about doing math and realizing that I could, if I used mathematical tools, if I could describe the phenomenon I was interested in mathematically, I could use mathematical tools to accomplish the things I wanted, or to learn, at least to learn more deeply about the system than otherwise. So 3 years of working with him, writing various papers, and
did these papers form the thesis, or was one large? It was.
No, they formed the thesis.
What was the connecting point between the papers? What was the overall theme, if there was one?
Well, they were fairly disjoint, and so it was a little bit of a challenge. Yeah, I mean, at Caltech, the way you wrote your thesis was really, you write a bunch of journal papers, and then you staple them together, write an intro and a conclusion, and that's your thesis. Yeah. And that was the accepted way of doing it. So I had to figure out, in these fairly diverse problems, what was a unifying theme. And so I ended up titling it Semiconductor Lasers, New Geometries and Spectral Properties. So I could include both my papers on the different geometries that I was putting curved mirrors on semiconductor lasers. And I was doing studies on their spectrum, the line width and related things. So really those two things don't have much to do with each other, but that title gave me justification to put them all into the same.
Was JPL a factor at all during your graduate study?
Not at all. I had done, I guess the summer after Stanford, I did a summer job out at Hughes Research Labs in Malibu, and made some good connections and friends out there. That was where Bill Bridges had worked. I enjoyed chatting with his former technician. He told more fun anecdotes about the good old days. And then worked there part-time as a grad student, but after because pocket money, but not too long into the year, Amnon said, I need you full-time here. And so I quit that. But that was the only outside connection I had, really, during my graduate work.
What were the key conclusions of your research from these disjointed papers? What did you find?
I found that you could, in the unstable resonator paper, which is making resonators that have curved mirrors like this, that you could disrupt the formation of filaments, the patterns that created junky patterns in large beams. I found that temperature fluctuations were a plausible mechanism for the power-independent line width, and whether they were the source is probably, no one knows still to this day. I worked on what are called coupled cavity lasers, that if you take two lasers of different lengths and put them side by side, so that light from one leaks into the other, that you could select for particular lines of operation. Prior to that point, if you made a single laser, its spectrum looked like this, but if you put two together, you could get a single line showing. And then there was one that was more, that it was the paper I was the most proud of. And it was published in PhysRev rather than Journal of Quantum Electronics, which was a method of doing dynamic analysis on arbitrarily complex cavities. That if you could write down the equation for the equation that described what frequency it oscillated at, you could create a series expansion that gave you the dynamic equation for time varying behavior. So if you wanted to know how it oscillated, you start with that equation that describes its static single frequency of operation. But buried in that equation is enough information to create the dynamic equation, how things vary over time. This equation has no time dependence in it. But from that, I can extract information that gives me the time-dependent equation that I need. And I was very proud of that. I don't know if anyone's ever used it. Probably not. But it was just so elegant that I had to do it.
Do we see an afterlife of any of this work out in academic labs or in industry?
I doubt it. I haven't really followed.
So there wasn't necessarily a clear pipeline from Amnon's academic world and what was happening at Ortel. That was not an automatic connection.
No, there definitely was a pipeline, but I wasn't involved in the high-speed work. There was other students. So Amnon, with this huge group, they worked on a wide variety of things. There were people who were still doing photorefractive effect, nothing to do with semiconductor lasers, but doing phase conjugation. And I think Amnon had at least 3, maybe probably more, several companies spun out of his research group. So there was Ortel, there was the one of my fellow students, George Rokeljic, spun out a company based on his photorefractive work, phase conjugation, and since the stuff I was doing had nothing to do with high speed, it was more about high power. It didn't have relevance to Ortel, but because it had high power, it certainly got probably was seen by the high power laser company that I ended up at 5 years later. So, graduated from Caltech, from Amnon's group PhD in 86, and Carrie had done a 1-year, what amounted to a postdoc, but it was with a company, a 1-year company program in Germany that he had spoken very highly of, and he said, if you're interested, I'll make a connection. And with them, and he did, and I did, and it sounded interesting. But I thought it'd be really hard in Germany to go interview with companies. So I did all my interviewing during the period between graduating and actually going to Germany, and got my job offer from JPL before I went to Germany. It was while it was still sort of fluctuating. And then after I got the offer, I said, hey, I'm considering doing this German thing. Would you hold the position open until I get back? Because it's only a year. And fortunately, my future boss said yes. And he was also a Uriv graduate. His name was Yossi Katz, and he had come out of Uriv's group.
Now, origami, are you still a hobbyist with origami during graduate school?
Yes, but origami, for me, really revved up when I became an undergraduate at Caltech. And the mental picture I have is that Caltech was, for the first time, revved the mental engine I was fired. My mental engine was firing on all cylinders just to be able to keep up at Caltech, and it revved up not just the math brain of Caltech and the Caltech courses, but it revved up everything. And so I really started doing a lot more origami and designing new things as an undergrad, and then that continued as a grad student. But in fact, by the time I graduated as an undergrad, I had enough new designs that I thought I ought to be able to write a book about of my designs, because I had learned from books of people's designs. I had a bunch of new designs. A lot of them were really complex. And
so you were innovating even as a hobby. You were creating new designs.
Oh yeah. I mean, I started creating new designs when I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
Because I liked to experiment and try new things, and I wanted to create subjects that weren't, after I learned how to fold everything in every possible book I could find, there were things I wanted to fold that weren't in any books.
Yeah.
Or there were things that were in my books, but I didn't think they did a very good job, and I wanted to do I thought it needed to look different than the one that was in the book. So yeah, so even in high school I was creating new designs. But I really revved up creating new designs as an undergrad. And so when I was at Stanford, I started drawing the diagrams for the book I was writing using the mechanical engineering school skills that I'd learned in high school to do technical drawings.
Did you publish that book?
I did. It took a few years. But
it came out during graduate school?
No. It didn't come out until 1989.
So you were working on this sort of on the side
Yeah.
during graduate school.
Yeah.
Were you drawing any intellectual connections between Amnon's group and origami? Is there anything about laser physics or optics that fed into your origami interests?
None at that time.
Separate worlds.
Separate worlds. However, one thing I was doing was both doing mathematical analysis and writing computer codes to analyze lasers. And so that got me thinking about how do you represent concepts mathematically and computationally.
Mm-hmm.
And started thinking about how would you represent origami design concepts. Because I had already by that time developed this notion that you could design origami figures by representing their parts by circles and finding a packing arrangement of the circles in the paper. And say, well, could I, and if it's just a few circles, you can sketch that, like if you're packing 4 circles in a square, it's got to be boom, 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 boom. But what if they're all different sizes? What if there's 10 of them of various sizes? What's the way you pack them to get them all touching? I thought, how do I solve that problem mathematically? And I learned that in fact that was a problem mathematicians knew, circle packing. It was in one of Martin Gardner's books, which I had read. And so, well, how do I do that computationally? Okay, well, you can represent a circle by its center and its radius. And if you say, well, I want 2 circles to touch but not overlap, well, the distance between the centers has to be greater than or equal to the sums of the radii, right? This distance plus that distance, maybe there's a gap between them, but they can't overlap. So there's an equation that relates based on the centers of the circles and the sizes of the circles that says these 2 can touch but not overlap. Now, if you've got 10 of them, you've got, well, not just 10 equations, because every possible pair of circles, there's an equation that says, so you've got, 45 equations. And so I thought, well, that's a lot to solve, but I could, using a lot of the programming I'd been doing were solving sets of equations, I could use one of those techniques to solve those sets of equations. So the techniques I was using to do my laser research, I could see them being useful in solving the origami problem, properly described mathematically. So I went to Germany. Diane and I got married just a few months after I graduated. Graduated in June. We got married in September. Went to Germany in December.
This is a 1-year appointment.
It was 1-year appointment.
Postdoc?
Equivalent. It was. My position was called what translates to a development engineer, but it was the equivalent of a postdoc.
And what was the organization?
As SEL Alcatel, a German company that they made train software and controllers, but they also had a group doing fiber optics work, and that was the group I worked with. While I was there, I invented a new type of laser that produced a single frequency wavelength,
which is a technical achievement.
Yeah. That was. I think that was. I don't know if that was my first patent, but it was an early patent.
Where in Germany is this?
It's in Stuttgart, which is in southern Germany, Baden-Württemberg. We took
Land of Mercedes.
Porsche. Porsche factory was right across from the train station from where I worked, so we could see the 959s roll off the line and say, yes, that one is Boris Becker's. It was an adventure.
Did you know any German, or did you pick up German?
Before I went, I took both Diane and I took German classes at Caltech for several months to try to learn a little. That was woefully inadequate. But I also, while I was there, 2 mornings a week, I took German classes. The company offered German classes for all the foreigners that they hired, and so I learned. I could get by pretty well by the end of the year. Although we learned High German, Hochdeutsch, High German, which is the standard German that's all over the world. But in Baden-Württemberg, they speak Schwäbisch, which is a dialect so different that other Germans don't understand it.
Oh, wow.
One of my colleagues said, who was from northern Germany, said, you don't understand when they talk about it. Don't worry about it, neither do I.
This was a good experience. It really broadened your vista.
Yeah, it was good. And then I came back and started work at JPL.
Did you, when you were in Germany, did you feel the rumblings that ultimately would lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall? Was that apparent?
Not at all.
Not at all.
So I was there in 1987, and it was 89 was the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't feel the rumblings of that. I'd say was not very hooked into German domestic politics and all. Also rumblings I didn't feel were rumblings in Pasadena. When I woke up one morning, opened up the International Herald Tribune, and the front page photo was a collapsed building in downtown Pasadena.
Yeah.
Do you remember My People Are the People of the Desert?
Yeah.
And that collapsed in that earthquake. So we were in Germany for that.
Lucky. And you kept up the origami.
And I kept up the origami.
The book is still in train.
Yeah, and was determined when I got back to start submitting out the book.
Robert, if I may suggest, this is perhaps a perfect narrative chapter break for a subsequent conversation when you begin your JPL career. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
All right,
okay.
Good.